Greetings. I am Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am the co-director here of the Wade Center, along with my husband, Dr. David Downing, and we are delighted to be able to have someone speaking tonight about one of our 7 Wade authors. She begins her website with these words: Amy Orr-Ewing is passionate about apologetics, presenting and defending the Christian faith in a way that engages with culture. No wonder she's interested in Sayers. That sentence could have been said about Sayers. With a doctorate in theology from the University of Oxford, and I just found out she wrote her dissertation at Oxford about Sayers, Dr. Orr-Ewing is the author of multiple books, including Where is God in All the Suffering, very apt title these days, and the best-selling Why Trust the Bible. Doesn't that sound intriguing? Over the last 20 years, she has given talks and answered hundreds of questions on university campuses around the world. She has also addressed parliamentarians in the speakers' rooms and chapel at the UK Parliament and staffers on Capitol Hill, as well as at the West Wing of the White House. Have you seen the West Wing on TV? Oh, good. Most important of all, Dr. Orr-Ewing is interested in the intersection of questions of meaning and faith with the marketplace, education, leadership, and policy making. So we are promised to have a very stimulating evening, and here our speaker will talk about truth, story, and pattern, key to appreciating the apologetic contributions of Dorothy L. Sayers. Amy.
Thank you very much for that welcome, Dr. Downing, and it's great to be here at the Wade Center. It was a joy to spend some time here whilst researching for my DPhil, and I came on a number of occasions, and special thanks to Laura, who was heroic as the librarian here, always finding the right thing at the right time and making sure the citations were correct and legal. So that was good. And today we're going to explore together some of the themes that I really explored in my DPhil, looking at the importance of truth and story and pattern in the works of Sayers. The methodology I took was recommended by Professor Alistair McGrath, who suggested that I read all of the letters and works of Sayers in order as she was writing them. So, read the letters, including her letters about, British public transport, but while she was interacting with people and thinking about what she was writing, and that turned out to be a really wonderful experience. So a little bit of introduction. Well known as an author of detective fiction and religious plays, also as a translator of Dante, Sayers was an insightful lay theologian and, crucially, a public advocate for the Christian faith. We might say an apologist. She emerged as a really eloquent voice in her generation, articulating the Christian faith in an accessible and in a persuasive way. So speaking of Dorothy L. Sayers and C.S. Lewis, the then Regius Professor of Divinity at the University of Oxford, Canon Oliver Quick, wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, in 1943, describing them as the 2 people who seem really able to put across to ordinary people a reasonably orthodox form of Christianity. Some bit of British understatement there. Karl Barth recommended Sayers to a student, calling her one of the most outstanding British theologians. That's high praise from the German theologian there. And he actually read her books to help him learn English, and he went on to translate 3 of her essays into German. Sayers was born, in the 13th of June 1893, and baptised at Christ Church Cathedral. My college actually was Christ Church, Oxford, so there's another connection to Sayers. And she was taught by a governess at home. Her clergyman father also spoke to her a lot. And she has a loosely biographical, unfinished novel called Cat O'Mary. And she describes one incident from her childhood, which I think really shines a light on the reflective intellectual child that Sayers herself was. So through her character Catherine's words, Sayers used the geometric principles that she'd been learning in the schoolroom to locate a hidden tennis court in the vicarage garden. And this is what she wrote. If the court had not been precisely laid out in the first instance, she might have had more difficulty. But the corner being accurately placed, the laws of geometry held good. In her heart of hearts, Catherine was awe-stricken. To see a prophecy made on paper, fulfilled on the back lawn, is a very enlarging experience. To say as this was an early experience of a pre-existing pattern being revealed in the specifics of life. The mundane lines of the tennis court took on a sort of symbolic importance to her as she saw how geometry, in theory, actually played out in real life. And to her, that was almost a quasi-religious experience. She'd been brought face to face with beauty, she writes. It had risen up before her again, the lovely, satisfying unity of things, the wedding of the thing learned with the thing done, the great intellectual fulfillment. Nothing would ever quite wipe out the memory of that magnificent moment when the intersecting circles marched out of the page of the Euclid book and met on the green grass in the sun-flecked shadow of the mulberry tree. Deeply intellectual young person, Sayers then went on to Oxford, where she won the highly prized Gilchrist Scholarship and read modern languages at Somerville College. And she flourished academically and socially, and she earned what's known as a first-class degree, which is you're placing in the very top students of your year. And she sat her final examinations in 1915, but was only given the honour of the actual degree in 1920, when Dorothy L. Sayers was among the first group of women upon whom an Oxford degree was officially conferred. So she was in that first group. In May 1920, having applied for various jobs, Sayers secured a position full-time working at S.H. Benson's advertising agency as a copywriter. And she was really grateful for the work, quite frankly. She needed the money. And it was in that context that she began to write her detective novels. But she had a gift at communicating with the public, and she came up with slogans like, "My goodness, my Guinness." And she's also credited with coming up with the phrase, "It pays to advertise." She worked with the artist John Gilroy at Benson's, and together they developed the commercially successful idea of the mustard club for Coleman's mustard. And I think her experience of working in a professional advertising agency where she was focused on communicating with the general public in a persuasive and memorable way laid foundations of skills which she was later to draw on in her Christian writing. In her first whimsy novel, Whose Body, 1923, was finally published, she already had clouds of witnesses ready and waiting in the pipeline. But despite her success, this era was very personally and spiritually challenging. And she hints at this in her use of the advertising industry as the setting for her novel, The Murder Must Advertise, in which she described perceptions of truth in advertising. How about truth in advertising? Of course, there is some truth in advertising. There's yeast in bread, but you can't make bread with yeast alone. Truth in advertising, it's like leaven, which a woman hid in 3 measures of meal, provides a suitable quantity of gas with which to blow out a mass of crude misrepresentation into a form that the public can swallow. During this time working in London, Sayers fell in love with a member of the Bloomsbury set called John Cornice, who was a novelist, and the progress of their love affair is documented in her letters. But there was a spiritual dimension to Sayers' formation as a writer. She wrote in a letter to her mother in January 1922. John turned up the other day and was all right, though deeply buried in Babel, his third novel. He and I have had a difference, though, on a point of practical Christianity, to which he strongly objects, and I may hear no more of him. Kornos wanted to have a sexual relationship with Sayers outside of marriage, using contraception to be sure there would be no children. Sayers hoped not only to marry the man she loved, but also to bear his children, and as a committed Anglican at the time, her conscience would not allow her to use contraception. Kornos was adamant that he would never marry anyone or have any children, and they separated over the issue. Sayers began a short-lived relationship with a motorbike mechanic, and since she neither loved him nor had any desire to bear his children, in her despair, she did sleep with him and use contraception. However, it failed and she became pregnant and had a son. Her misery was compounded upon discovering months later that Kornos had gone to America, got married, and now had children with his wife. Apparently, he had wanted her to surrender her spiritual principles to him, and if she had done so, he would have married her. And Sayers' letters over this reveal a level of emotion and spiritual passion, which sometimes people don't see because she's seen as this quite austere, very funny, humorous, but unfeeling intellectual figure by some. So this is a quote from one of her letters. "I'm afraid my hero worship was perhaps not quite so abject as that of the lady to whom you refer. I mean that though doubtless you feel that your company would be sufficient reward to compensate for any amount of spiritual filth, I'm afraid that if it excluded frankness and friendship and children, it will remain a maimed thing. You broke your own image in my heart. You stood to me for beauty and truth, and you demanded ugliness, barrenness. And it seems now that even in doing so, you were just lying." So there are a number of letters. They're all here at the Wade Centre in her handwriting, which is just amazing to be able to read her written words written by her own pen. On January the 3rd, 1923, Sayers gave birth in complete secrecy to a son who she named John Anthony. She carried on working until the day before giving birth, and she just wore larger and larger clothes, and people just thought she'd got rather fat. People didn't know. And she arranged for her cousin Ivy, who was a professional foster carer, to take the child on. And only a couple of weeks after the birth did Sayers actually confide in her cousin that she was the mother of this child. Sayers suffered a lot through that episode, and obviously there was a great strain of secrecy upon her professionally, and she had a real fear of the exposure of this. And I wonder whether her reputation as a theological thinker might have risen considerably more in the 1940s and 50s if it hadn't been for the residual problem of keeping her son's existence a secret. In 1943, upon the success of her religious play, The Man Born to be King, Dr. Welsh, the head of the BBC, wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, asking that a Lambeth Doctorate of Divinity be conferred upon Sayers. And he talks about the astonishing effect of the plays on regular churchgoers and asks whether she could be given the Lambeth DD. And Temple writes back and agrees and does offer the Lambeth DD to Dorothy L. Sayers. And when she receives the offer, she's reluctant to accept. And this is what she says: "Your Grace, thank you very much for the great honour you do me. I find it very difficult to reply as I ought because I am extremely conscious that I don't deserve it. A degree in divinity is not, I suppose, intended as a certificate of sanctity exactly, but I should feel better about it if I were a more convincing kind of Christian. I shouldn't like your first woman DD to create scandal or give reviewers cause to blaspheme." And she decided not to accept the DD. So that's a little bit on of a whistle-top tour of a little bit of backdrop to some of her life, her early life. And I'd love in the next section of this lecture to explore the key apologetic influence. So Sayers, although not given to very specifically or concisely defining her terms, does seem to view these three terms of truth, story and pattern as being very significant. Sayers envisioned truth as that which the artist imagines and communicates when producing work that explores the unity of reality and apparently disparate concepts. She writes, the associative values of words which make them such bad tools for the scientist make them the right tools for the poet, for they facilitate the establishment of similarities between many widely differing concepts, and so make easy the task of the creative imagination building up its poetic truths. Sayers' ideas of truth were literary and creative, but she also had a theologically informed set of ideas about God and Christ that underlined her understanding of the nature of truth. She said, if Christ is the eternal truth, his coming should fulfill not merely the Jewish prophecies, but all prophecies, all the religious intuitions of man. And this didn't mean that she understood religious truth as being plural. In fact, Sayers contended that truth about Christ made contradictory religious beliefs incompatible. She says that Christ is in his own person, wholly and uniquely God, is fundamental to the Christian faith, and any religious system which is otherwise founded is alien from Christianity and incompatible with it. So truth for Sayers is grounded in the person of Jesus Christ. She found that faith and truth sometimes ran counter to an individual's personal preferences. She wrote, faith is not primarily a comfort, but a truth about ourselves. What we in fact believe is not necessarily the theory we most desire or even admire. It's the thing which consciously or unconsciously we take for granted and act on. Sayers' convictions about Christ were founded in part on her belief that truth has historical dimensions. The message of the Christian faith is that our vague feelings about right and wrong are quite true. Our vague dreams of a God in human form, dying and resurrected, are true. The thing did happen. It has an actual date. And in this essay, A Vote of Thanks to Cyrus, she sort of reflects on her amazement that Cyrus is, in the history books and also in the Bible. So it mattered to Sayers that Christ came at a particular point in history. She said, in most theologies, the God is supposed to have suffered and died in some remote and mythical period of prehistory. The Christian story, on the other hand, starts briskly in St. Matthew's Gospel account with a place and a date. Sayers understood truth also to mean correspondence with reality, and in her mind she was grounded in the existence of an objective supernatural reality, namely the Creator. And she writes, one necessary act of faith, the thing is reasonable, I can trust my reason so far as it goes and my moral sense so far as it goes. They correspond to a real truth and a real goodness outside me and the world. In a letter to the Reverend Dom Ralph Russell on the 28th of October 1941, Sayers spoke of her frustration with the so-called experts in theology who are not able to communicate truth in a meaningful way to ordinary people. And she wrote this, they will treat God as an elderly invalid who might collapse from shock if suddenly intruded on by a common person. One of the lay apologists' great difficulties is the difference between the technical and everyday meaning of the words in the theological vocabulary. Over and over one hears preachers preaching merrily away, and one wants to call out, stop, stop. The words you are using don't mean to the people what they mean to you. After a time, the people get to imagine that theological statements mean nothing, never did mean anything, and were never intended to mean anything. That's why it does seem to me that it may be useful for some common or garden person like myself to come along and say, look here, this isn't just verbiage and mumbo jumbo, it means something quite concrete and relevant. It applies in the most matter-of-fact way to my everyday existence. I love that Sayers thought she was a sort of ordinary garden variety person. Forget the first Oxford and the best-selling novels. So alongside the centrality of truth, really rooted in the person of Jesus Christ, Sayers understood the power of story. And I think we can learn something from this today. In her diverse canon of work, story and truth are very closely related. C.S. Lewis noted, it's astonishing how little attention critics have paid to story considered in itself. And he went on to be stories at all. They must be a series of events, but it must be understood that this series, the plot as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. A well-written story, thought Sayers, produces a true and measurable effect, precisely as though it had in fact taken place within the work of art. Sayers realised that a story enabled the expression of truth imaginatively in a way that the synthesis of words and images created by an artist had tremendous power to communicate essential reality. And her observations about the story, a power of story, were theologically grounded in her belief that truth and story were perpetually grounded since God, the eternal truth, entered human history in the incarnation of Jesus. And she wrote this, I love these words, the official story, the tale of the time when God was the underdog and got beaten, when he submitted to the conditions he laid down and became a man, like the men he had made, and the men he had made broke him and killed him. This is the dogma we find so dull, the terrifying drama of which God is the victim and hero. Sayers believed that the life and death of Jesus Christ were not like any other story. From her perspective, the historicity of the Christian story was crucial. About 33 years later, God was executed for being a political nuisance under Pontius Pilate, much as we might say when Mr. Johnson Hicks was Home Secretary. It is as definite and concrete as that. She described Christian dogma as the greatest drama ever staged. And reflecting on Christ, she claimed, it is the dogma that is the drama, not beautiful praises, nor comforting sentiments, nor vague aspirations to loving kindness and uplift, nor the promise of something nice after death, but the terrifying assertion that the same God who made the world lived in the world and passed through the grave and gate of death. She had a wonderful way of bringing the sort of simple heart of the Christian faith to life. She spoke about the dogma of the incarnation is its name in theology, but for my purpose tonight, I would rather call it the story of the gospel. The incarnation of God, or the gospel of Jesus Christ, is not a system of ethics, though it contains a code of ethics. It's not primarily an explanation of the universe, though it provides a rational explanation of the universe. It is a story. What kind of story? Well, it's not a story about a nice young man called Jesus who was very religious and had ideas in advance of his age about brotherhood or internationalism and the working man, and being ever so kind to children, who taught a good way of life and unfortunately got into trouble with the police and was killed. That would be just another human story of a kind with which we are only too familiar. No, it's a story about God. It's also a story about man. It is a story about the relations between God and man from the beginning of time forever. It's a story about our Father and about you and me and our sons and our daughters to the end of the world. It is the story, the key that unlocks all history. You can sense from her writing the passion, and what she described as the passionate intellect at the heart of her Christian faith, but the passion for this truth. There's the end of that quote. So Sayers' understanding of Christian theology was actually completely dependent on story, and initially the genres she deployed, although they changed over the years, and she did write essays and theological books, she also wrote in a storied form, obviously both the detective fiction, but then actually the religious plays. Writing about the positive reaction to her play, The Zeal of Thy House, amongst those who could not believe that anything so interesting, so exciting and so dramatic can be the orthodox creed of the church, Sayers insisted that if her play was dramatic, it was not in spite of the dogma, but because of it. The The story of Passiontide and Easter is the story of the winning of that freedom and of the victory over the evils of time. The burden of guilt is accepted, the last agony of alienation from God is passed through, the temporal body is broken and remade, and time and eternity are reconciled in a single person. The new kingdom of God is built upon the foundation of spiritual experience. So there's this beautiful connection between truth and story that's integral to her Christian apologetics. I love this quote. It's not a story about believing God and he will keep you safe from bombs and bankruptcy. It's the story of how God himself endured the worst of misfortunes. Last thought about her thinking on story. She wrote that all stories have authors, but God, the author, put himself as a character in his own story. If this is true, it is obviously an event of a paramount importance because it alone is authoritative. So Sayers wasn't just a creator of stories specialising in detective fiction. She also grasped the paradigmatic importance of story within Christian theology. Okay, then very briefly, we'll then introduce the next theme, and then I want to just look at her different genres as well. So I'm going quite quickly. I hope that's all right with you all. So pattern. Alongside story, Sayers' thinking and writing were underpinned by this concept that she frequently referred to as pattern. When I was setting out on this DPhil, I had this intuitive sense that Sayers is very much shaped by narrative, drama, story, but there's also something kind of about this rootedness in the fundamental coherence of reality. And as I read her work, discovered this theme of pattern coming through. The Christian revelation for Sayers was the pattern undergirding all meaning. She said, the important thing to say is that the gospel is the story, and that if anyone calls himself a Christian, he's accepting that story as the pattern for all history. She saw Christian doctrine not as a set of rules, but as a vast interlocking rational structure. And in her mind, the individual pieces of a particular given question should always fit within a whole. The evidence leads to a conclusion within a particular framework where apparently disparate aspects, when arranged, make sense. If you've read her detective fiction, that sort of sense might feel familiar. Now, this all stems from her intuition that the creator has designed things to conform to a pattern, and pattern is then worked out in the life and experience of human beings and in the creative processes that we undertake in life, so that human creativity and patterns reflect divine reality. The same pattern inheres in my work as in myself, and I also find that theologians attribute to God himself precisely that pattern of being which I find in my work and in me. Sayers was clear that her understanding of pattern and the ensuing coherence of reality didn't actually necessarily imply a deterministic outlook. She envisaged it as a wheel. At the rim of the pattern, the lines of potentiality lie wide apart and may take almost any course toward the node. But as they close in, the area of available choice becomes narrower and narrower. But the element of personal choice remains to the last moment. And she draws a comparison between herself as the writer of a novel, who kind of knows the characters, and increasingly, as you get to the nub of the issue, there are less and less possibilities of what characters can choose and do. And she lays that alongside the idea of God as the creator and the universe not being totally predetermined. So one of my favourite pieces of Sayers' work is her radio talk broadcast on the BBC called The Religions Behind the Nation, and it was broadcast during the Second World War. And in this speech, Sayers is attempting to talk about Christian doctrine and explanatory potential for the lived experience of people in Britain whilst being bombed and having a totalitarian regime, fighting against them. So Sayers noted that it was commonly agreed in Britain that people wanted to defend what she called our culture. But she wanted to ask the question, what is our culture? It's quite interesting if you think about politics today, these debates. We've had it with Brexit, you've got it in America. I have this constant questioning, who are we as a nation? What is our culture? So she argued that the critical point at stake in defining the culture of a nation was not the ideologies preached or the religious outlook of people or groups of people, but rather the assumptions we hold in common about what is good. The things we take so much for granted that we never argue about them at all. So the speech was written and broadcast in 1941, and Sayers reflected on what she thought British culture presupposed. All men and all races possess certain rights in common just because they are men. We take it for granted that such things as freedom, mercy, charity, truth, tolerance, justice and peace are good things. By contrast, Sayers pointed out that the Nazis absolutely deny such assumptions. They base their new order of civilization on the contrary assumptions that inferior races have no rights, that mercy and charity are effeminate vices, and that war is more desirable than peace. She concluded this may seem to us to be what she called sheer barbarism, but the basis of such a reaction, but underneath that basis lay two basically widely held assumptions. And she said, reason cannot prove those assumptions and science can't offer any evidence for them. And the assumptions are that both our conception of the good and our human reason are actually valid. So she's saying our conception of good as a moral category and our sense that human reason is valid at all, neither of those two things can be upheld by science or are just patently obvious. She went on to examine Roman Greek Enlightenment thinking and concluded that the enlightened human reason can establish almost anything except those two things, which a human culture depends. It cannot prove that goodness is not an illusion, and it cannot prove that reason is not an illusion. And this is how she then connects her thinking to the Christian faith. She felt Christian dogma can provide a coherent foundation, both for goodness and for reason. This is what she said. It asserted that the things which man had believed about right and reason from the beginning of time were neither idle dreams nor wishful thinking, but actually and earthily true. It claimed, in fact, that man's persistent belief in goodness and reason were justified, that such was the nature of God and the true nature of man, and that Christ was there to prove it. Christianity offered the actual physical fact of the incarnation. Christianity took theology out of the realm of myth and allegory and pegged it firmly into history. It picked up, so to speak, all the scattered ideas about God and man and the universe, which had been lying around like loose beads, beautiful but disconnected, and ran through them like a string the historical personality of the God who was made flesh. The necklace envisaged by Sayers was the string of the incarnate Christ in history, pulling together beads into a coherent shape that was in fact a pattern. And then she says, it is the pattern of those beads on that string that is the pattern of our own civilization and culture. We've grown accustomed to the look of it. We've spent 19 and a half centuries polishing the beads. And during that time, we've been tempted to feel that the only thing that spoils the look of them is the ugly string of Christian dogma running through them. For the last 3 centuries, we've been snipping away at the string, strand by strand, forgetting that it was the string that made the pattern in the first place. What we've been trying to do for some time is to keep the Christian ethic without the connecting thread of Christian theology, the beads, without the string. We can, of course, hope or imagine that the pattern will hold together of its own accord, but we have no rational warrant for supposing that it will. Indeed, the witness of history contradicts that supposition. I encourage you to go and read the whole speech. It's fascinating. In her novel, Whose Body?, Peter Wimsey comments that a particular incident threads together no beads in my mind. So this image of a necklace and beads and thread was obviously there from a bit earlier, but from way before 1941. So pattern, as conceived by Sayers, could be conceptually architectural or structural, or pattern could be fabric being pushed or pulled together, or a tapestry. There's one moment in The Man Born to be King where the idea of Lazarus is a sort of tapestry, and you go round from one side of the tapestry to others, and the knots look very messy on the back, and then you go and see the front of the tapestry, and it's very beautiful. So, Sayers' most acclaimed theological ideas about the Trinity are an outworking of her interest in pattern. The analogies she developed in her theological explorations of the doctrine of the Trinity, most famously sort of developed in her book, The Mind of the Maker, are themselves developments of this deeper and longer search for pattern. She wrote, "If you ask me what is this pattern which I recognise as the true law of my nature, I can only suggest that it is the pattern of the creative mind. And this is the pattern of the being of God. If all this is true, then the mind of the maker and the mind of the maker are formed on the same pattern, and all their works are made in their own image." Let's have a brief look at some detective fiction. Sayers' detective fiction forms a noteworthy part of her canon. It's interesting to me that people who sort of love C.S. Lewis and Christians who are interested in Dorothy L. Sayers perhaps are less familiar with her detective fiction, and then people who love Lord Peter Wimsey so find it very odd that she was this full-on Christian. And there's this sense that there's a discontinuity between the detective fiction and the rest of her work. But actually, I think differently. I think there's a fundamental coherence. Obviously, there's a development that happens as she grows up. But Bruce Merry argues Sayers' methodology in her detective fiction was to assemble an intense intellectual structure, so pattern, tapering at its apex and based on a single revealing idea which explains the whole plot. So you have this interplay of pattern and story and this interest in truth. Now, Howard Haycroft, writing in 1942, gives us a context for detective fiction in the English language. 1 out of every 4 new works of fiction published in the English language belongs to the category of detective fiction. And Sayers wasn't just a detective writer, she was also a reviewer. She reviewed 364 crime books by 233 authors. For the Sunday Times, an average of 3 a week. So she read them and wrote a review for the newspaper. And 25% of the total output of crime fiction in those years, the golden age of crime writing, was reviewed by Dorothy L. Sayers. So she was not a slacker, let's put it that way. Beginning in 1933, and ending quite abruptly in sorry, there's a typo there, no L, not sure why, 1935, there you go, there's those statistics. So Whose Body, just a little bit of flavour of some of these, published in 1923, she later wrote that although she'd set out with the avowed intention of producing something less like a conventional detective story and more like a novel, what had actually been produced was conventional to the last degree, no more like a novel than I to Hercules. So that was her own assessment of Whose Body. And it sort of revolves around the deductive reasoning of her detective, Peter Wimsey. Then we've got Clouds of Witnesses and Unnatural Death, which both follow a sort of general pattern where the data can only make sense when someone pieces the story together. The deductive reasoning power of Wimsey comes to a sort of clear finale with the detective putting disparate pieces of evidence together as a pattern that makes sense of everything. The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club was to contain a deeper intellectual and spiritual challenge to her readers. In Strong Poison, the falsely accused Harriet Vane is rescued from the hangman's gallows by the detective genius of Peter Wimsey. And then 5 Red Herrings is a sort of puzzle. And I actually really enjoyed that, but I know quite a few people who hate that one, 5 Red Herrings. But anyway, it's a mystery reliant on a train timetable, which if you're English, it works. And it's based in the Scottish countryside. So Sandra Percy writes, what was important to Sayers was the alignment of plot, theme, character and setting, the search for wholeness that pervades the entire canon of her work. In The Nine Tailors and Gaudy Night, we see that for Sayers, detective fiction was a crucial context for the development of the deeper themes that were of lifelong importance to her. The quest for truth, the importance of integrity, and the role of story and pattern in detecting and discovering the truth. Taking it all in all, I think it's true that each successive book of mine worked gradually nearer to the sort of thing I had in view. So there's definitely a sense of development. Reflecting back later in life, Sayers began her essay Problem Picture with a broader observation. We've begun to suspect that the purely analytical approach to phenomena is only leading us further and further in the abyss of disintegration and randomness, and that it is becoming urgently necessary to construct a synthesis of life. I love that phrase, a synthesis of life. The quest for truth, which took disparate and detached ideas and concepts and saw them making sense as they came together in a pattern or story, underpinned not just the detective fiction, but all of her writing. And it's expressed really beautifully in her essay, Making Sense of the Universe. I do not think we can afford to live any longer in a universe which makes no sense. It is hardly an overstatement to say that to 99 people out of 100 today, the world, and man's life and man's place in the world have come to appear completely irrational. Detached bits of it they understand. They know how an internal combustion engine works. They know how food is transformed into energy or how the solar system developed out of nebula gas. They understand the mechanics of the material world, but they do not understand what it is all for, or where it is going, or what they are doing in it. We cannot go on like this. Somehow we have got to rescue the human mind from the chaos of stark bewilderment. In a sense, that's what the detective fiction is doing. It's taking you into bewilderment and then a bit like with a chord, that's discordant and then is resolved. Now, the Christian revelation does do that. It does make sense of the universe. Let's think for a few moments about the plays. So the next sort of season of Sayers' output, having written her detective fiction, which obviously did really well and enabled her to have financial independence, she went on to write 9 plays with 6 being religious in character. So I'll just put up a few images of some of these plays. That's actually The Man Born to be King, The Just Vengeance, The Emperor Constantine, and so it goes on. Ian Wilson comments, Sayers' religious plays had an enormous impact on the radio audiences of wartime Britain. Before the radio plays, though, after doing her Busman's Honeymoon play, which was sort of resolving the relationship between Lord Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane, her play, Zeal of Thy House, written in 1937, was written for the Canterbury Festival. And it was such a huge success in that so many thousands of people wanted to see this play live at Canterbury Cathedral that more trains had to be laid on from London Victoria to Canterbury. So it actually, really, really had an impact, as well as the radio plays. So radio was a relatively new medium of communication, which Sayers adeptly co-opted for her uncompromising commitment to present Christian dogma as truth to as large an audience as possible. She sought to present she saw it as an admirable medium through which to break down the convention of unreality surrounding our Lord's person. And she sought to present a plausible, in a modern sense, such scenes as Jesus walking on water or reappearing from the grave after 3 days. So an essential aspect of Sayers' achievement in the Man Born to be King play cycle, which was on the radio, was her commitment to using vernacular language. And she wanted to find an appropriate balance in her use of language so the drama of the Christian story could kind of come home to people in an accessible way without resorting to trite or hackneyed language that might offend people. Sayers realised that the wider British public conceived of Christ as a rarefied figure located in a folk story or morality tale. It was as if Christ wasn't born into history, he was born into the Bible, the authorised version, a place where nobody makes love or gets drunk or cracks jokes or talks slang or cheats or despises his neighbours. No wonder the story makes so little impression to the common man. It seems to have taken place in a world quite different from our own, a world full of reverent people waiting about in polite attitude for the fulfilment of prophecies. So opponents of Sayers objected to the potential of blasphemy in the very idea of a play dramatising the life of Jesus. So the Daily Mail, I don't know if you've heard of the Daily Mail, but it's, makes sane people roll their eyes just hearing those words, the Daily Mail. They ran the headline, "Life of Christ play in US slang," which, as you can hear from Sayers, it's very far from US slang. The Lord's Day Observance Society and the Protestant Truth Society began a campaign against Dorothy L. Sayers and her plays without ever having read them. But what happened is that caused them to be even more popular and brought way more attention to them. If the mere representation of it has an air of irreverence, what is to be said about the deed, she says. Sayers hoped that the audiences who heard her plays would be disturbed out of thinking of Christianity as something they know to the point of boredom, something that never actually happens, something that never looks to them remotely like anything that actually happened. She wanted to sort of wake people up. My job, as I see it, is present the thing as best I can as something that really did happen, as actually and unmistakably as the Battle of Britain. And then she says, if the incarnation had never happened, it would have been necessary for some dramatist to invent it. So over 2 million people heard the plays that first time round on the radio, and she had reached such a huge audience that you can actually look at church attendance statistics, which I did in the doctorate, and you can see it had an impact. So Sayers has put the Christian church in this country in her debt by making our Lord, in her fine phrase, really real for so many of us. So that's the head of the BBC who said that, who knew what the figures were. So Sayers wrote a lot about drama as well. She called the Christian faith the most exciting drama that has ever staggered the imagination of man, and she spoke of the dogma as the drama. I'll just briefly touch on the Mind of the Maker, and then we'll have some time for questions. So the Mind of the Maker is probably her one sort of full-length book. The others are collections of essays, really, but a full-length book exploring Christian theology, and essentially it's predicated on her conviction that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity provided a foundation for truth, reality, and crucially human creativity. I'm writing a short book which has some bearing on the subject, the Trinity, from the point of view of the creative artist, who keeps a kind of working model of the Trinity inside his own mind, forming a useful analogy to the great Trinity that created the world. She has this idea of the Christian Trinity kind of reflecting the Trinity that any artist who's creating any piece of art, whether it's a painting or a novel or a play or whatever, of the idea, the energy to actually do something, and then the activity or the power, the outworking of the piece of art. And she says this is a sort of outworking of the Holy Trinity. The creative Trinity is a sort of pattern, a structure for truth that is reflective of the Trinitarian God himself. Sayers wrote a number of essays. These are some great places to start. I love that title, Unpopular Opinions. C.S. Lewis, in his eulogy at Sayers' funeral, called her that ogreish lady. You know, I don't know how many of us would like to be spoken of in that way at our funeral, but my favourite essays, if you were just dipping your toe into Sayers' writing, would be her 3 essays on work, living to work, why work, and vocation in work, and her 2 essays on women. She wrote, Are Women Human? Very relevant today. And then she wrote The Human Not Quite Human. She engages with the different concepts of feminism. She did not regard herself as a feminist, but she did want to challenge the church and its hierarchy to see that this, the humanity of women, was an area where Jesus Christ had modelled something entirely different to what the culture around us says, as well as what is actually seen often in the church. Christ did not have a reductive view of women to their biology or a particular sociological sphere. And Sayers felt the church of her day was failing to show who Jesus was in this matter. Perhaps it is no wonder, she famously said, that the women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man, and there never has been such another. A prophet and teacher who never nagged at them, flattered, coaxed, or patronised, who never made jokes about them, never treated them as the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, but who rebuked without querulousness and praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them and never urged them to be feminine or jeered them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took them as he found them, was totally, completely unself-conscious. If Jesus was God incarnate, revealing the ultimate pattern of truth and its specific outworking in history and society, Sayers wanted to challenge the church to look and reconsider her treatment of women and consider following Jesus's pattern. And she attempted to provoke a whole sort of set of conversations around that in the church, at which she was not particularly successful. However, the essays are great. Sayers' essays reverberate with her convictions about truth and her intuitive appeal to a correct pattern within which the pieces cohere and make sense. Without such a structure, she believed humanity goes adrift and the consequences are far from abstract. And that took her to reflect on economic theory, Aristotle and detective fiction. I mean, it's very, very diverse what she writes essays about, but utterly fascinating. In the next era of her work, she was to discover resonant echoes of pattern in the writing of Dante, to whom she was introduced by Charles Williams. She then went on to do a translation of Dante's 3-part poem, and Penguin picked it up and it became the most successful English language translation of Dante. And she wrote lots of essays about Dante and completely fell in love with him in the last years of her life. So to conclude, in my work, what I was interested in was the apologetic value of theological truths through story and pattern in the works of Dorothy L. Sayers. And if you're interested, my DPhil thesis, 100,000 words, is available here at the Wade Centre in print, but you can also download it on academia.edu if you'd like to read it. She was a professional woman working from the 1920s through to the 1950s, and she marshalled the medium of her day, the radio, drawing on lessons she'd learned in mass communication through the advertising industry and successfully capturing the imagination of a generation, of the general public, about Christian theology. And her grasp of the power and vibrancy of story, and sometimes she calls it drama, but I think the concepts are interchangeable, and the intrinsic coherence of pattern lent Sayers a really unique apologetic edge, and her works reached thousands of people. Sayers described coming to God through her love of the intellectual pattern of the Christian faith. And it was this irresistible play of pattern and story that gave rise to what she called the passionate intellect. And this motivated her work and I think enabled her to become the best known and most effective female public advocate for the Christian faith in the English-speaking world in the 20th century. Thank you for listening.
We have a time now if any of you have questions for Dr. Orr-Ewing.
I have a question about the detective fiction. So Lord Peter Wimsey, of course, is a great detective. He comes to this scene where there's inexplicable things, and he finds the pattern behind it, as you say. But it so often seems to depress him. Nine Tailors, when he's looking over the countryside as he's leaving it, he's in a condition of melancholy. Mm-hmm. And of course, when he saves Van, which I don't know, she rejects his proposal, at least in that book. And then in Busman's honeymoon, it ends with him weeping on his knees before his new bride because of the part that he's played in executing the murderer who's discovered. Solving the puzzle seems unsatisfactory. Finding the pattern seems unsatisfactory. Do you think that it has any relation to the fact that Sayers was so adamant that she would not make Lord Peter a Christian? She would not lead to his conversion.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really interesting insight. I think you've answered your own question, but also she did sort of try and kill him off a few times. You know, she found it to be quite a burden to keep him going, and the public was so in love with him and enamoured with him on one level that I wonder whether it's also her slightly contrary nature, that ogreish lady, that she couldn't have the happily ever after ending. I also think she was a woman who suffered greatly. She did eventually marry, but it wasn't a happy marriage, and there were multiple unresolved chords in her own life. And so I wonder whether she wanted to have that sort of seam of melancholy in her main character to reflect that depth of her own experience. I'm not sure. I'm sure there are people who are far more expert, maybe Crystal, on the detective fiction, but that would be my take. But thank you for your observation.
And just to add, I mean, see, you wrote that short story where you see Wimsey as a father, and he seems to have found a great deal of contentment there.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Following that, did she write herself into the story, and she became Harriet Vane?
Yeah, so, I mean, she was very reluctant to admit to that, but I think to most people it kind of does look a lot. There's certainly a lot of overlap, and you really see that in Gaudy Night when she locates her in Oxford College, and, you know, Sayers certainly could have had a scholarly career and chose not to. You know, she went to work in advertising and she worked as a writer. She didn't have a hankering for the academic life, and obviously you see that when Harriet Vane goes back to visit her Oxford College. So again, I think there was tension around that, and you've got to remember she was also younger when she was writing the detective fiction and working full time. So it was kind of this outflow really pouring out of her. But she was resisting, you know, she had that image of the wheel and the spokes, but I think she was resisting the impetus to be too closely identified with Harriet Vane. Much more close identification is with Catherine in that unfinished book, Cat and Mary, which people do think is, and she kind of indicated, is quasi-autobiographical. Yeah.
Have you done much thinking or work about the echoes or influences or similar themes between the apologetics of Sayers and the apologetics of Lewis? Have you done much thinking about that, or?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So their correspondence is fascinating, and it's here. just I know I'm going to keep saying that because you are so lucky to have this incredible resource, and it's amazing to be able to read, you know, their letters to and from each other. One of the funniest things I think is how she sort of told Lewis off. She thought he veered outside of his lane far too much, you know, that he knew a lot about English literature, but he kept on sort of blundering into things that he didn't know enough about to write about. And he obviously quite liked having this friend who would sort of challenge him. And Lewis famously read The Man Born to be King, you know, every year, once a year, and really admired that. I think that was his favourite of her work. In terms of the overlap and the influence back and forth, I haven't done a sort of exhaustive, that wasn't the kind of focus of my work. The focus of my work was more looking at her whole oeuvre, if you like, looking at all the genres and everything she wrote and asking, is there a kind of coherence to it? Are there strands that hold this whole thing together? But that would be an interesting... And she was obviously massively influenced by Charles Williams, possibly almost more, and particularly at the end of her life, she really admired him. And the figure of Beatrice, that was his sort of her gateway into falling in love with Dante.
You were talking about parallels between Lewis and Sayers, and just in your lecture, the idea of what is the basis of goodness, what is the basis of reason, those are very important to Lewis.
Yes, that's true, of course.
And also that the mythic gods from prehistory actually came into history. I think both of those were influenced by G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah.
You find the germ of those ideas in Chesterton, and I think they both benefited a lot from reading his work.
Sayers talks about, you know, I think she's 14 or 15 and her favourite book is Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. And then she asked her father to send her a Greek New Testament so she can start learning Greek at school and read it herself. You know, she was very much formed, and obviously he wrote detective fiction as well, so deeply influenced by Chesterton for sure. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
So most of the reading I've done from Sayers is found in The Mind of the Maker, and I think that, for me, that was a really impactful book, apologetically and even evangelically, or evangelistically. But I wonder if the popular world is particularly receptive to that kind of thinking, and I was wondering, how successful was that book initially? Did people receive it well?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. So it was supposed to be part of a series called Bridgeheads, which never really kind of got off the ground. But the idea of it was that Christians who were not professional, not priests or like professional Christians or theologians, would write a work that connected their field of knowledge, Christian theology, and the sort of felt need of the culture, if you like, a work of apologetics. And it wasn't enormous, it was nowhere near as popular as, say, her plays or the detective fiction. But I think she was kind of trying to reach a different kind of person with it, a more niche person. So in her letter, she has, you know, extended correspondence with skeptical people, you know, philosophers and others who she's seeking to persuade about the core elements of the Christian faith in different ways. And I think she felt, as an author, you know, as a successful best-selling author who's regarded as, you know, truly excellent in her professional field, she could write a work that really connected creative art with Christian theology. But I don't think it was, it doesn't sort of register as hugely successful. But for those who were of more of an artistic bent and who were probably less interested in evidential, historical apologetics or whatever, you know, it's certainly intriguing and interesting. And it's also, you know, she's picking up from some of the themes in A Zeal of Thy House, and that she also then picks up in her essays on work, where she's looking at the interplay between human beings, our vocation, our reflection of the Creator. So interestingly, I would say today, those ideas are quite influential now as people think about theology of work, because so few people have written in that sphere. So maybe it's time for The Mind of the Maker to become a bestseller. Yeah.
Can I add a little
yes,
message?
please.
I just read C.S. Lewis's review of The Mind of the Maker when it had just been released in 1941. And his problem with it at 1941 was the sense that if we fulfill the Imago Dei by being creative, that will reinforce the religion of art that was dominating culture at that time. And you have someone like I.A. Richards, who both Lewis and Sayers mention in their letters, who would say that, we can't believe in God anymore, but art will console us. Art will save us. And so Lewis criticized Mind of the Maker for that problem. But then, after he read the plays, the radio plays, Man Born to be King, later Lewis described Mind of the Maker as indispensable.
Yeah. Because he'd sort of seen it in action, in a way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
This one's more out of curiosity, but I was just wondering, why do you think Sayers wrote the Lord Peter Wimsey series? Because her other writings seem to be much more apologetic, but that one just seems like they're genius, but it just seems like fun. I don't know if she had a point, or was it just a business for her?
No, well, it was a business, and for a woman to be financially independent in 1924 was quite a big deal, and it meant she didn't have to work in something she found really uninteresting, advertising, even though she was excellent at it. So there was definitely a financial component to it, but no, she saw it as art. She was trying to write a novel, and you've got to remember that the detective fiction genre was the genre of that cultural moment. So it would be a bit like, I don't know, in the 1990s, you're a filmmaker and you're going to do a romantic comedy because they're all romantic. That's the genre that is connecting with people. So, and obviously she was then also as a critic as well. So she was kind of seen as an authority on it in some way. So she does speak of how it gave her financial independence, which was extremely meaningful to her. And she does stop writing them. She didn't want to be stuck in that forever, but she feels, so she writes a series of essays. Aristotle on detective fiction is one of them, but in the 1940s, reflecting on the detective fiction, and she feels very much it's a part of her art and an integral part of, her writing career that she's not ashamed of. And particularly Gaudy Night. Has everyone here read Gaudy Night? So I'm not going to spoil it for you, but how the whole thing hangs on the idea of how much does truth matter. So the scout, the lady who cleans the college rooms, her husband had taken his own life because he'd been found to have overlooked a detail in a footnote, and his academic career is over. And the woman who's found this out is in the college, right? So the whole thing hangs on how much does truth matter? How much does integrity matter? Is it a matter of life and death? And that's a pretty serious topic for a novel, isn't it? Yeah, or theme for a novel.
I'm so new to Dorothy Sayers. I've always been curious about her. And I'm really curious now when you said about where would you find most of her work on the theology of work?
So there's three essays.
Those three essays,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, those 3 essays, which you can find here at the Wade Centre.
Amazing, amazing. And it was it the picture you had where the 3 books, were they titled?
Yes. Hold on. Where's
That's what I
that
thought, okay.
So the work essays are in, well, one of them is in Beyond Opinion, I think. I can't remember exactly where. I'll show you afterwards.
They're all in Creed or Chaos,
Yes.
a
okay,
collection.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, the title
right.
of the book they named after one of the
Yeah.
essays.
Love that. Great.
Any other questions?
Thanks for your talk. For a beginner, I mean, I've read the essays on the work, but what do you recommend on the Peter Wimsey novel? Where to start?
With the novels,
Yeah.
which one to start
The
with?
detective fiction. I mean,
Oh,
what do you
gosh,
recommend?
that's so hard.
Thank you.
So maybe start at the beginning, but maybe not. She didn't like the first one herself. Someone else help me out. Where should this gentleman start with it? I mean, don't start with Gaudy Night. That is my favourite, but
Either Murder Must Advertise
yeah.
or Strong Poison.
Yeah, I love Strong Poison as well. Strong Poison. Thank you, Laura.
I don't remember Nine Taylors. It's kind of disconnected from the rest.
Yeah.
Peter Wimsey is someplace where he's kind of away from his usual.
Yeah, I like Nine Tailors, but I wouldn't start there because I think you've got to sort of get into the whole church bell thing, haven't you? Which is a bit, if you didn't grow up in the fens of Cambridgeshire, Norfolk. Yeah.
Have they done any of these in film, like, you know, the Father Brown stuff with G.K.
Yeah,
Chesterton? I don't recall seeing anything.
No, I mean, there was when I was a teenager, there was a version of Gaudy Night done by the BBC, I think. Does anyone? But are they good?
There's two actors, Edward Petherbridge and then Ian Carmichael as Wimsey. And the Petherbridge ones, I think there's just 3, maybe 4.
Yeah.
But Carmichael did a whole lot of them.
But actually, the audiobooks are really good if you're looking for something to rather than read. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Let us thank Dr. Orr-Ewing again.